Yeah, Minister, as I said earlier, and I would like you to respond, the question of the sort of double standards of, on the one hand, rightly condemning the authoritarian, brutal, murderous, warmongering activities of Putin in Ukraine, but then on the other hand, collaborating and having arrangements with regimes that do exactly the same thing is indicative of shocking double standards. So Tunisia, which is mentioned in the second paragraph, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, I have raised here a number of times the fact that the Said regime, which is now effectively a dictatorship, has locked up the entire opposition. The Ceann Comhairle might be interested to know that I met the son of the Speaker of the House in Tunisia. The Speaker is a guy called Moad Ghannouchi, and he's in his 80s, and he's been imprisoned by the Said regime, along with all of the opposition, effectively. And that was a democratic assembly that arose from a popular democratic movement in Tunisia that was part of the Arab Spring, and the Said dictatorship has just locked them all up. And we're now doing a deal with this regime, as they do that to democratically elected representatives. I mean, I just find it incredible. How can we honestly be taken seriously, Minister, or the EU, saying we denounce authoritarianism, and then we make a strategically sort of self-interested arrangement with a regime that's doing that? Now, have we called for Moad Ghannouchi's release and the release of all the opposition people in the Tunisian parliament as a condition of any further involvement or arrangement with the Tunisian regime? And similarly, I mean, I met with the UN Human Rights Council Commission dealing with Israel and Palestine, and the reason they asked to meet me, and I think they said the same thing to the government, was because they are shocked how different legal standards are being applied to what Putin is doing in Ukraine to what Israel is doing in the Palestinian territories. They're just shocked by it. They think there's no legal consistency in the approach of the international community to two situations where the same crimes have been committed, but there's a completely different attitude to those crimes, because in one case it's Russia and in another case it's a Western ally, the United States.
Thank you.
Please respond to those, because they are very, very important issues, and frankly, if we don't address them, our credibility is zilch.
I'd like to thank the Deputies Ceann Comhairle for their statements and questions. I will now address the further issues that were discussed in the June European Council meeting. The 2 decades on from the Thessalonica Summit declaration, EU leaders reaffirmed their commitment to the Western Balkans and stressed their need to spur reform across the region and accelerate merit-based EU accession. Regional stability underpinned by improved neighbourly relations is critical to the prospect. In that context, leaders condemned recent violence in northern Kosovo and called on parties to de-escalate tensions and re-engage with Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. The EU's Special Representative Lajčák addressed the Joint Committee on EU Affairs 2 weeks ago. As he outlined, the municipal elections held in northern Kosovo in April may have been legal, but with a turnout of under 4%, they were not legitimate. As such, leaders agreed on the need for early elections for all 4 municipalities. Beyond that, it is imperative that the government of Belgrade and Pristina recommit to the agreement on normalisation reached in North Macedonia in March. As the European Council underlined, this must include the establishment of an association of community of Serb-majority municipalities. I made these points myself last month when I visited Serbia and addressed the Prespa Forum in North Macedonia. As a beneficiary ourselves half a century ago, I recall that Ireland has always been amongst the strongest supporters of EU enlargement. But if the policy is to be credible, it must be fair and merit-based, to ensure they are prepared for the rigours of EU membership and to protect the integrity of the enlarged Union. Candidate countries must reform their institutions and meet EU standards. Delivering such reform is difficult, but the rewards are real. As the Special Representative Lajčák observed, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has seen enlargement return to the top of the European political agenda. This presents an opportunity for the Western Balkans if they are prepared to take it. Across the EU, it is our interest to do what we can to aid them in that effort. Ireland, alongside the rest of the European Union, is in favour of finding a comprehensive settlement to the situation in Cyprus in accordance with the relevant EU resolutions. We are strongly supportive of the efforts to facilitate the resumption of negotiations, and we welcome the European Council conclusions, which highlight the EU's readiness to support that process. The European Council's request for a report from the High Representative and the European Commission on the state of play of EU-Turkey relations is also a positive step. Tunisia, a new EU-Tunisia partnership package, covers 5 key pillars: cooperation between the EU and Tunisia. The package will support the resumption of a political dialogue between the EU and Tunisia, and the 900 million in support to the Tunisian economy will facilitate economic development, investment and trade in green technology, migration and people-to-people contacts. The Government is also committed to multilateralism and greater engagement with the countries in Africa, as set out in the Government's Africa strategy. The European Council's support for the reinforced presence of the African Union in the international fora, including in the G20, is very welcome. Just in relation to a few of the questions, first of all in relation to Deputy O'Murchu, I responded there in relation to Cyprus in my closing remarks. We also met the ambassador from Cyprus today as well, who's actually finishing her term here, and again reaffirmed our support for a UN-based solution, and we're working through that, and we have been a very strong supporter at the European summits. Secondly, in relation to Israel and Palestine, which a number of deputies have quite rightly raised, I do note the Taoiseach had a very strong statement out earlier on this month in connection with the condemnation of the illegal settlements and the violence perpetrated by Israel on Palestine, and was very, very strong in terms of the response in relation to it. In relation to the Western Balkans, you raised and the roadmap, I touched on that in my speech. Obviously, we have the 6 countries in the Western Balkans that we're working very closely with, trying to assist their accession into the EU. I know President von der Leyen made a significant contribution in Bratislava recently, where we have to see what the flesh and the bones of her terms, where she set out potential staged membership for some of these countries, so essentially we don't lose them into the future. And also the Eastern Trio with Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia is also progressing, and I do note the Commission is going to give an update, I think in September, in relation to each of their conditionality and how they are progressing. In relation to yes, the Inflation Reduction Act raised by yourself also and Deputy Howland. Obviously, in the 30th of June at the European Council meeting, the European Commission undertook to do an impact assessment on it in conjunction with EU member states, and our Department of Enterprise are working with regard to that. So I'll try and get you an updated note on how it's progressing. But we have been, in all our discourse over the period, to be very strong in not distorting the single market, ensuring that we don't enter into a subsidies race, and that there is evidence-based approach to any decisions that are taken, because there is a significant risk, obviously, as you have pointed out here before, for countries with bigger economies to absorb the bigger industrial bases, and that's a present risk to Ireland. So obviously we're keeping a very, very close order on that. In relation to China, as you quite rightly raised, obviously the human rights issues are very significant. I do note the Taoiseach made a significant contribution in relation to our policy on China quite recently, and covered in very detail in terms of his concerns that were well reported at that time. I think in terms of where Europe is looking, is trying to de-risk in terms of its reliance on China, and that's a big part of our strategy. And if you look at in terms of the Critical Raw Materials Act, pieces of legislation that are coming forward like that, in terms of trying to get to grips with the green transition, that we are not reliant on a country of its scale, and only it arguably, for some of these components, and leave ourselves very vulnerable in keeping a pace with that technology. In relation to Tunisia, I've referenced that in my speech there, also Deputy Boyd Barrett, and I do hear your concerns, and I will relay those concerns back, and it can be difficult in terms of getting a balance, trying to have bilateral agreements to improve other countries, improve their environmental standards, green technology, and also issues around migration, which are a huge issue on that side of Europe. So we will work, and I will raise your concerns, obviously, that you've put in the House, which are very troubling indeed, and I will raise those. In relation to Deputy McGrath, in terms of migration, and Deputy Howland, I think, raised as well. So obviously, at the moment, in terms of the conclusions to the EU summit that weren't reached, whereby the President did give a summation himself in relation to it, obviously, the two countries in question are not as accepting of the QMV process now and want to bring it into the unanimity forum at the European Council, which obviously the decision was taken already for the two pieces, the asylum and migration management regulation and the procedure regulation. Obviously work has to be continue on both of those. I don't think we've made a cabinet decision yet that we are going to be part of it, but I understand the government is positively looking at it. And obviously the key tenets of that are trying to, in the first instance, ensure that our procedure is quickly to adjudicate on safe countries, and the 12-week period is contained in that procedure regulation, and also in relation to what was referenced by Deputy McGrath as well in terms of the burden sharing aspect of it. And in relation to you know, you're talking about caps or limits on Ukraine. I think in the first instance, you know, we have to be very careful that, you know, we don't breach the Convention of Human Rights. We are a very outward-looking country in Ireland. I think we can all be very proud of that. And if you look back over the last 50 years where we've come from, whereby almost 5% of our population was born abroad 50 years ago. Now it's 1 in every 5, and that just shows you how outward-looking country we are. I think we're all the better for that diversity as a country, and I do note in terms of, in my community, the huge heroic work communities are doing, rising up to the challenge to really assist and provide all the services for Ukrainian citizens who find themselves in this awful position. And we really have to be effusive in our support, I believe, for Ukraine to maintain obviously the international rules-based order and the aggression, and particularly for children, which was referenced in the debate earlier on. I was very struck by, you know, the amount of children that have been abducted and taken into Russia, almost like a major reset, which is very distressing to hear some first-hand testimony of that, which I did when I was over in the UN. And in relation to Deputy Pringle and the European Peace Facility, well, obviously there's a key component of that, like Ireland takes forward in neutrality. And I've mentioned here before how I was struck by my Austrian colleague, that when she was out in Ukraine and a missile hit a building adjacent to where she was, that when the first responders and the firefighters were out trying to save people and obviously quench the flames, they were wearing Austrian uniforms, and that could really show through that facility what her country was doing in a neutral capacity, and really brought it home. And Ireland can be very proud of what it's doing in terms of bringing spare parts for its grid, the public infrastructure that's been damaged. We've heard about the dam water parts, and also you know, key supports that ordinary citizens need there. I think I've hopefully went around most of them. Thank you. Or Frontex, yeah, we're not part, obviously, of Frontex, so that's the external border, but it's part of the European Union, but each country has its own agreement with Frontex, and obviously that's the external border, so we haven't.
Thank you, Minister.
I'm not aware of any funding we're providing to them, but I'll just check that point for you.
At that